In the past 3 years, the advance of technology has provided about 1 percentage point of warranted real wage growth each year. That is only half, admittedly, of its pace in the good old days, but that is still something. Yet, even with improved underlying productivity, real wages right now are 4% below their values in the fall of 2018. Does that sound like a high pressure labor market likely to trigger an inflationary spiral to you? Now, those who claim that the labor market is in some sense tight respond by pointing to the Employment Cost Index, up some 4.5% from its value a year ago, 1.5 percentage points per year faster than the 3% per year rate of growth that the ECI had settled in the pre-plague Trump administration years. But the consumer price index is up 5.4% from a year ago. The ECI basis real wage has fallen by 0.9% over the past year. Does that really, again, sound like a tight and a high pressure labor market to you? Now, nowcasting is extremely difficult and hazardous. But the now I see outside my window right now is the now that I forecast 2 3/4 ago. One in which you would leave inflationary skid marks on the asphalt as we reopened, but in which those should not concern us, because burning rubber to rejoin highway traffic at speed, that is not the same thing as overheating the engine. We do not, I repeat, we do not have too much money chasing too few goods, leading to inflation spiral provoking overdemand for labor. This is the case even though the plague continues and its associated disruptions continue to give us a substantial undersupply of labor. Right now, labor demand and supply are interacting to give women 5, African Americans 4.5, blue collar workers 4, and the economy as a whole 3 percentage points of employment below what we used to think as the full employment level of the employment to population ratio. In a high pressure economy with a tight labor market, workers' bargaining power would be strong enough to get them real wage increases. Yet we do not see those substantial real wage increases out there, except in very specific bottleneck industries. And yet there are economists I respect greatly who talk as if the economy is in serious inflationary trouble. Jason Furman speaks of how the, quote, original sin was an oversized Biden American Rescue Plan, unquote. In his view, it would have been better to have been less aggressive, to have had a slower employment and growth recovery this year. For the ARP he sees as oversized, it, quote, contributed both to higher output but also higher prices, unquote. Larry Summers thinks, in Jim Tankersley's paraphrase, quote, inflation now risks spiraling out of control, unquote. I don't see that. Now, the next move in the argumentative chess game is to say that, yes, it looks as though there is a very large gap between the current level of production and employment and what full employment would be after the plague, but that the plague years have permanently damaged the supply side of the economy, caused lots of early retirements, disrupted permanently the lean and mean supply chains on which a great deal of productivity and prosperity had depended, and that we will never get back to even close the level of employment that we had before the plague, that people have just changed what they want to do with their lives. Perhaps. But the same arguments were made in the early 2010s. In fact, I made the same arguments in the early 2010s, and I was wrong. Back then, I made them as an argument that we had to get back to full employment as fast as possible. Others used them as arguments justifying policies that did not put the pedal to the metal and attempt to rapidly reemploy those who were back then called zero marginal product workers. And indeed, one consequence of not putting the pedal to the metal was the Donald Trump. Donald Trump's rise was fueled by the rage of those who saw the system as caring more about immigrants and minorities than it did out of blue-collar workers whose opportunities had never recovered to what they saw as the pre-2008 normal. Putting restoring full employment at the back of the bus of one's priorities. That is not just unwoke because of its disproportionate effect on minorities. It adds to the dangers to and the difficulties of democracy as well. And while the financial market's 30-year inflation break-even is more than half a percentage point above where it had seemed to be settling in the second half of the 2010s, it is still only at 2.35% per year, where it had settled in the first half of the 2010s, and slightly below the level that would be consistent with the Federal Reserve's 2% per year PCE deflator inflation target. With the inflation we see out there right now highly likely to be, perhaps others would say probably or even arguably, but I call them as I see them, with the inflation we see out there highly likely to be simply rubber on the road from recovery, with no sign that inflation has yet been incorporated into those prices in the economy that are sticky, with the labor market still weak enough that workers are unable to demand substantial increases in real wages, with financial markets blasé about the possibility of rising inflation, and with a substantial fiscal concentration already in train over the next year or so. Why would anybody argue that they know that the original sin was the oversized American recovery plan, and that tightening monetary policy right now is the proper way to expiate this original sin? Yet people do. People are. I cannot say that I can follow the logic here.